Welcome to episode 91 of Lucretius Today. I'm your host Cassius, and together with my panelists from the EpicureanFriends.com forum, we'll walk you through the 6 books of Lucretius's poem, and we'll discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. We encourage you to study Epicurus for yourself, and we suggest the best place to start is the book Epicurus and His Philosophy by Canadian professor Norman DeWitt. For anyone who is not familiar with our podcast, please visit EpicureanFriends.com, where you'll find our goals and our ground rules. If you have any questions about those, please be sure to contact us at the forum for more information. In this episode 91, we'll read approximately Latin lines 1002 through 1125 from Book 6, and we'll discuss the details of how magnets work, and then shift to preliminary comments about diseases and plagues. We're happy to say that Don is back with us this week, and Joshua is here too, so our panel is once again back to full strength. Now let's join Don reading today's text.
And first, many seeds or effluvia are continually flying off from the stone, and by their blows disperse and drive away the air that liest between the magnet and the iron. This space being empty, and void made between, the corpuscles of the iron rush out suddenly in a train, all linked together into this vacuum, so that the whole body of the iron ring to which they are joined immediately follows. For nothing is made up of seeds more entangled and connected together than the cold and touch substance of iron. And therefore, as we said before, it's less to be wondered if the seeds cannot fly off from the iron into the void, but those before must draw on those behind, and the whole ring follows at last. Which it does, and continues to move, till it comes close to the stone and, fixed by secret bonds, sticks to it. And these effluvia of the iron that lie nearest the stone rush into the void every way, upwards or across, wherever the space is empty, for they are driven by the force of other seeds, nor have they any power to move upwards by their own natural motion. You may add another reason to account for this experiment, which is that the iron is driven forward and assisted in its motion from without, from the air before the steel being more rare, and the space between more empty and void than it was. Hence it is that the air that is behind strikes upon the back of the ring and drives and forces it on, for the air that surrounds all bodies beats upon them with continual blows. But then only it drives on the iron from the spaces empty on that side and fit to retrieve it. The air, therefore, which I observe, entering into the many pores of the iron and subtly conveying itself into the little passages, thrusts and forces it on, as a ship is driven by wind and sails. And then all things must contain within some parts of air, for all bodies are rare and full of pores, and air surrounds and pierces through everything. This air, therefore, that lies concealed in the body of the iron is always tossed with violent motion, and beats upon the ring, and agitates it within, and so the iron is carried on toward the void to which it was moving, and whither all its force was first directed. But sometimes the substance of the iron will fly from the magnet. It will withdraw sometimes as well as press towards it. For I have seen little Samothracian rings of iron and filings of steel put into a brazen pot, and the stone being applied to the bottom of the vessel, the iron will leap and dance upwards, so eager it is to be gone and avoid the stone. And this great aversion rises from the interposition of the brass. For when the particles of the brass have entered and filled up the open pores of the iron, then come the effluvia of the lodestone, and finding the passages of the iron full, and no more open for them to pierce through as before, they beat upon the bits of iron and drive them forward with all their force. And thus the particles of the stone, passing through the brass, throws the iron from it, which otherwise it would take to its embrace. Do not be surprised to find that the effluvia of the stone do not drive away other bodies from it in the same manner. For some remain unmoved upon the account of their weight. Gold is of this sort. Others because they are rare and their pores are wide, and so that the particles that fly off from the stone pass through without touching, and therefore can have no power to move them. Of this kind is the texture of wood. The nature of iron is placed between these two, and when its pores are full of those brazen particles, then it is that the effluvia of the magnet beat upon it and drive it off. Nor is the friendship between the lodestone and the steel so singular a case. I can produce instances of many things whose natures are peculiarly fit and suited to each other. And first, you observe that stones are cemented together only by lime, and boards are so joined together by glue made of the ears and genitals of bulls, that the solid wood of a table will sooner split than the strong joints of glue will start or fall asunder. Wine will mingle with spring water, when heavy pitch and smooth oil will not. The purple color of the murex incorporates so into the body of wool that it never can be taken out. No, not if you strive to recover it to its native whiteness by all the waves of the sea, not if you wash it in all the water of the ocean. There's but one material that will solder gold and silver together, and brass is joined only by white lead. How many things of this nature might be produced? To what purpose? I would by no means lead you so far out of the way, nor give myself so much trouble in such inquiries. I have many things yet to explain, but I shall be as short as possible. Those things whose textures so mutually answer to one another, that the cavities of this thing agree with the plenitudes of that, and the cavities of that with the plenitudes of this, may be conjoined most easily and in the strictest manner. And some things may be so joined to others as if they were fastened together by hooks and rings, and in this manner it is that the lodestone seems to be connected to the steel. Now I shall teach from whence diseases spring, and whence arise the pestilential blasts that spread their deadly poison and destroy both man and beast. And first, as I have said, the seeds of many things are ever flying through the air. Some are sound and vital to mankind, and others bring on disease and death. These, when they arise and taint the sky, and air becomes infected. Now the morbid force of all diseases, every pestilence comes either from without, as clouds and mist from the heavens above, or rises from the earth itself when, drenched by fierce and unseasonable showers, and pierced by the sun's scorching beams, it sends unwholesome vapors through the air. Have you not seen that those who search out foreign lands and leave their country and their native homes contract new pains from the strange water and the air they breathe? The mighty difference of the air occasions this. For don't you think the air of Britain is widely different from the air of Egypt, where the North Pole is never seen? Or that the air of Pontus differs from that of Gades and Ethiopia, where the black race of men are thoroughly sodden with the sun's heat? The four quarters of the air, we may suppose, are different in their temper and their quality, because they are opposed to the four quarters of the earth, where men, we find, in every region widely disagree in face and complexion, and are tormented with diseases peculiar to the countries where they live. The leprosy was known first in Egypt, near the river Nile, and nowhere else. The Athenians are tortured with the gout, the Achaeans with sore eyes, so every country is an enemy to one part and member of the body or other, and this must be imputed to the air. And when the morbid, pestilential air of a country, remote from us, moves from its first abode, and the fatal vapor begins to advance, it creeps first by degrees like a cloud or mist, and disturbs and changes everything as it goes. And when it comes to the climate where we live, it corrupts everything and makes it like itself, and therefore is deadly and destructive to us. This wasting plague, these sad infectious blasts fall either in the water or fix upon the fruits of other food of men, or on the provender of cattle, or they may hang suspended in the air above, that when we draw our breath we needs must suck this poison mingled with it into our bodies. In the same manner the pestilence seizes on the cattle, and the contagion infects the sheep. The danger is the same whether we change our climate and travel into a country where the air is pernicious to us, or whether nature of her own accord brings the cruel infection from abroad, or introduces a disease we are not used to, which upon its first approach may prove hurtful to us.
Don, it's good to have you back, and thank you for reading that text today. We have a full strength panel with four of us here today, so hopefully we'll have a lot of good comments about this section of the text. And before we jump into the details, it would probably be best to set the stage again in general about what we're doing. Like everything in Lucretius, we are looking for natural explanations that explain how things work without resorting to any kind of a supernatural explanation. And today it looks like we're focusing on the operation of magnets and then disease and how disease can spread through the air. And I would say probably it's fair to say that what we're talking about again is sort of an action at a distance situation. I remember last week I made the comment that the description of magnetism seemed to be relatively decent to me. And now as we listen to it today, I know we have serious issues in terms of how the modern science would agree or disagree with what he's saying. But I think I will still sort of defend in a very general way that it seems to me that he's explaining both magnetism and the transmission of disease as a result of particles moving through the air, especially focusing on magnetism. And I'm very interested to hear what Martin is going to have to say about how magnets work and how this description fits with it. But it does seem to me, as a general layman who's taken some interest in science, that magnets probably do work to some degree because of the interaction of just all of the multitude of particles that are constantly flowing around them and through them, and of course through everything. So he's explaining the attraction and repelling nature of magnetism, and by connecting it to particle flows. He uses the word air here, it seems like, which I'm sure we would disagree with. But if you generalize and think about particle flows, which he's almost certainly talking about here, which explains so much of Epicurean philosophy, seems to me that at least on that very basic level, a particle flow explanation of magnetism is probably not too far off. But having said all that, let's see how much Martin blasts away at that. So, Martin, what do you think in general about the magnetism section?
Yeah, the thing is, it started good with the introductory part last week, because it was just referring to the observable phenomena. And also here, where it just reports the observable phenomena, of course, there's nothing to object. But I'm not aware of a really suitable model with particles. I mean, maybe there is, because every field you can define some exchange particles. But for a static magnetic field, it's just not the right model. So it's you just use a field model there, and there are no particles flowing. And then it becomes now really difficult to explain. I mean, I could now regurgitate the fairy tale which you read in textbooks, which give people something like a very simple, superficial understanding. And in that sense, it's not completely off. It's like this book I really like. Men are from Mars and women are from Venus. Now, of course, we all know both men and women are from Earth and not from there. But as an idea, as a model, that there can be entirely different, like being from different planets, I like this, and deriving then explaining some roots of his. And I think these school text explanations and these explanations by Lucretius are on that level.
Well, quickly before we continue, you're exactly right. And last week I failed to use the word field very often. And in my introduction today, I failed to use the word field. But field, of course, is what you read about when you hear about magnetism and gravity and all sorts of things like that. But the connection between the two is there's still a lot of controversy about the relationship between particles and fields, isn't there, Martin?
No, not. We know that for each field we can then somehow define some exchange particle, and so that one for some situations that works. So and these different models are complementary. Depending on what phenomenon you look at, then the one that is using then the particle model gives a good explanation, and in other cases not so good. No? So you can then still tweak it and bend it like this. But actually it's good to have both models. And to talk about static ferromagnets, I just don't see any benefit in using a particle model.
Well, before we go too much further, let's get Don and Joshua to comment on how they would approach generally this section. Don.
I mentioned it, I think, a couple weeks ago, but I find it so endearing, his powers of observation in talking about the iron filings in the bottom of the brazen pot. And I mean, I remember doing that as a kid with the toy where you could change the iron filings and give the guy mustaches and beards and that sort of thing and play around with it that way. And it's a very humanizing sort of thing to think of somebody playing around with the iron filings in a pot, 2,000 years ago. That's one of the things that I, like I said, find so endearing about this section here, over and above the basic, scientific inquiry and things like that. But it just makes me smile to think about somebody doing that 2,000 years ago.
Joshua.
So I'm looking at the notes here in the Rolf Humphreys translation. I like to go back to that. I'm just going to read you what he writes here on this passage on magnetism. He says, Lucretius's explanation of magnetism is an ingenious tour de force. All objects are constantly throwing off atoms from their outer surfaces. The lodestone, or magnet, in giving off a heavy discharge of particles, evacuates the air between itself and the iron ring nearby. And then he goes on, he continues to describe it. And then at the end he says, the relationship between magnetism and electricity was not discovered until the early 19th century. So what he seems to be saying is that even though we've been talking about fields here, even though Lucretius may have been wrong about this, Humphreys at least seems to think that this is an ingenious explanation for an unknown or poorly understood phenomenon.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think just the fact that he can extrapolate from atoms and void to why iron rings stick to a magnet is, I would call that a tour de force too, I guess, in some sense.
Mm-hmm.
And it's precisely the kind of objection, it's you have to be able to conceive of an explanation for every kind of physical phenomenon. And the ones that people are going to come back to time and again, if you deny, creation or the influence of the gods in the universe, is these weird cases where, normally things don't just fly toward each other. When you put an object somewhere, typically it stays there. But in the particular case of the magnet and iron, they will rush toward each other and clink together. And so a materialist needs to have an explanation of that.
I never really thought of that before, but you do really have to come up with explanations for those weird, quote unquote, weird phenomena that people say, well, what about that? Well, what about that? Well, that's obviously the gods at work there. And those are going to be the hardest ones to come up with because people have it in their minds that, oh, this is obviously something, just unexplainable. And to come up with a material, physical explanation for it within this philosophy is, and that was a challenge for him. And I think that he rose to the occasion. So it was, whether it's factually true or not, I think that he did rise to the occasion of explaining it in a physical, materialist sort of way.
I'm scanning over these first couple of paragraphs as we're talking, and I think what we're talking about is basically what they're relaying. I'm not sure that it's going to make sense to reread or drill down into particular sentences unless you guys see something that catches your eye up through like 1042 at least. I know one section that catches my eye is where it says that what he's discussing is like a ship driven by wind and sails, and I do think that's a good visual analogy of at least his theory. But I have to say, and the further we get into things we disagree with, the less useful the podcast might be. But I did not understand in 1042 the point he was making about interposing the brass pot between the filings of steel and the iron. I didn't understand where he was going with that. Did anybody get anything out of that part of it?
That was the part that I thought about the toy from my childhood where the iron filings are in that little plastic case with the picture of the guy on it, and you can like move the iron filings with a magnet underneath it and give him a beard and give him a mustache. I know I'm dating myself with this particular thing.
Right.
But if anybody else remembers it, feel free to let me know.
Of course, I had one of those. Of course, everybody had one of those.
And I think that's exactly what he's talking about here. That if you have a pot and you put some rings or some filings of steel in there, that it's the same sort of thing. If you put the magnet underneath the pot, then those filings move around inside the pot, and it's like how could this happen? How does it's magical, it's supernatural, and Lucretius goes, oh no, it's not. Here's what's going on.
In the toy you used at that time, did you actually see that it was pushed away, or did you only see attraction?
Oh, the idea was if you put the magnet underneath it, you could sort of get a clump of the iron filings and move them wherever you wanted to move them in the enclosed plastic sheet that was covering up so the filings didn't fall away.
So it was attractive, no? So
correct. Yes, correct.
What he describes here is also a repulsive force, and I don't see how this could come from unless these filings have become magnetic themselves. No?
That's exactly what I'm talking about. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. That's I think that if by some mechanism, and I use mechanism in the widest possible sense, some mechanism gets the iron filings magnetized too, then they're going to both be attracted to the magnet but repel each other. And so no matter what, there's going to be some activity going on in the bottom of that brass pot. So things are going to be moving around.
But Martin, he seems to be implying that the magnet and the particles would act differently towards each other if you interpose the brass pot. And that's the part I did not follow at all. Are you with me on that? Is a brass plate between a magnet and iron particles going to change the way the particles are attracted or repelled from the magnet?
No, it's more something like a distance. That you need to put some distance there so that you can that you still have some separation between the magnet and these particles, so that you can actually do some change. Because what happens if you don't have something imposer, these filings will just stick to the magnet, and then you can no more do anything. You have to plug them off and restart. No? So that is the idea, that you can just you need to have a interposer from which you can remove the magnet. And whether it's of brass or plastic, it will not make much of a difference.
I'm going to go far out to left field now and ask if there was a copper content in the brass, or it was a copper pot, would that do anything with the magnet and the copper? Is there any sort of electrical charge that changes or anything with the magnet? I am woefully...
I mean, there is copper in brass, but now I don't know how brass, the total properties of brass are with the copper in there. So I really would need to look this up, or I need to look at the electron configuration in there. Plus, there can be some subtle solid state effects. So this one I cannot just pull off the pocket where there is something special from the copper on that. But I'm not aware that it would do something much different. It could be that it's paramagnetic, and then in the presence of the magnetic field, it could weaken or strengthen the effect. But this is just that it will modify the effect of distance. So like the distance given by a certain thickness of copper, so that one will have a similar effect like material for another material of different thickness, but it will not do something fundamentally. Also, even if those iron particles, the iron filings, are small magnets, they will just turn around and then again stick to it. So I don't see that we can... Now what we can see with today's superconductors, so because they have a different type of magnetism, and which is at maximum strength for its size. And then you can make these things actually levitate. So, and this was not possible in the past. To demonstrate this levitation easily, because you could not get strong enough diamagnets. But with the superconductors, now we have that, and this gives then for even more dramatic effects.
Whenever we talk about topics like this, I always think it would be so much fun to be able to pluck Lucretius or Epicurus out of their time and plop them down into ours and go, hey, check out these magnets.
Mm-hmm.
Well, when we get to 1065, we're going to, I think, come to sort of a conclusion and a real payoff that we need to talk about. But we haven't heard from Joshua in a few minutes. So any thoughts, Joshua, before we go there?
I was mostly interested in the word lodestone as I was reading through this. I think I read something, because I wasn't sure, there's this, LODE. There's this idea in like mining terms or metallurgy, where a lode or a mother lode is like a really rich vein of particular ore going through the earth. And so I was curious where the word lodestone came from as it relates to magnetism. And apparently, I think it comes from the Middle English for leadstone, because of course, if you have a lodestone and you have a piece of iron, you can magnetize the iron and then use it to find north. So in Middle English, they called it a core stone or a leading stone, from the now obsolete meaning of lode as journey or way. Of course, I use a compass quite frequently in my work, so that was my primary interest in that section.
Oh, that is interesting. I noticed that you were talking about that, so I was looking it up on the etymology dictionary, and it's like there was also the term loadsman, which is a leader or a guide or a pilot or a steersman. So that's very cool. Okay. I wasn't aware of that.
I didn't know that one. Yeah, these are good words to know.
Martin, is there a German context to load or lead?
I'm not aware of that. Probably there is, but I don't know. Because anything, if you go back to really the medieval age, so this is then at a time when at least the Germanic part of English and German language were still much closer.
Oh, and the whole idea of the load in the mining here, it says the mining sense of a vein of metal ore is from the 1600s, from the notion of miners following it through the rock. So it was that whole journey sort of through the rock is where that term came from as well.
Okay, I was looking for that connection, but I didn't find it as quickly as you did.
Well, when you connect it to the word lead in English, it sure is something you can see a parallel to. Well, let's go to 1065, because that's kind of a linkage between what we've been talking about so far and then the issue of disease that comes up next. But in 1065, he talks about how he can produce instances of many things whose natures are peculiarly fit and suited to each other. And then he talks about lime being used to cement stones and glue used for wood and wine mingling with water, and the purple color of something I've never heard of and still don't know what it means, the word murex. I'm not sure what that is. But
those are the little sea snails where they get the purple dye.
Okay.
The murex snails.
You guys are probably going to see some passages in here you want to comment on in particular, but in general, it does seem like he's turning in 1065 to the comment that different particles react differently with other particles, and depending on the type of particle, that's going to determine how they interact with each other, which is a very, very, very basic observation, but probably central to Epicurean philosophy, that's how you predict the way things are going to work when particles come together, is you look at the nature of the particle, and then you can understand and even predict to some extent in the future how, when they come together, they will interact with each other.
This is one of Lucretius's methods of writing that I find somewhat amusing as well, that he'll go on for hundreds of lines about one specific topic and then have a lightning round at the end. It's like, well, there are many other instances of this that I could talk about, and this and this and this and this and this, and then just sort of throws everything in there at the end to get it into the poem at least. But he'll go for in excruciating detail about magnets here, and then say, well, then there's the purple dye, and there's the wine, and there's the stones, and there's the this, and there's, and it's basically like, you get the idea.
And there's many other things he could talk about, but why bother, he says. To what purpose?
Exactly.
I would by no means lead you so far out of the way, nor give myself so much trouble in such inquiries. I have many things yet to explain, but I'll be as short as possible. So it is interesting, these interjections that sort of convey the flow of things.
Yeah. The lightning round section.
Yeah. Martin and Josh there.
Yeah, I want to drill down on one thing. So, the first examples are all fine, or I don't know anything about it, but then there is an inconsistency in the translations. So here in Browne there is but one mineral that will solder gold and silver together, and the other translation talk about gold and gold. Can we see this in the Latin text, which one is correct? There should be a different word for gold and silver. So one of these must be wrong, translation-wise.
Okay. Yeah, there are different words. Gold in Latin is aurum, and silver, I think, is argent or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
I have not checked the Latin on that, but I was curious about that connection as well, that there's only one material that will solder silver and gold.
Well, that could be.
Yeah. Auro, it is gold on gold, because it's auro non aurum copulat ona. So making gold and gold into one, joining into one.
And there are different kinds of gold. There's white gold, rose gold, yellow gold. So yeah. I don't know if, I used to work in a metal casting foundry, but I don't know all the differences between them.
Yeah, they have different core elements in there. No? So I think this white one has more silver content, and so it depends what controlled impurities you have in there, or beyond traces, what minor constituents are added to the gold. Like copper will really give it a reddish color.
Okay, so these are alloys of gold. Okay.
The pure gold, if you bring down impurities as low as you can with metallurgical conditions, is very soft. And then to harden it, you then add other metals in there, mix it in, and then you get something what is a bit tougher.
Well, why don't you guys talk for a second about glue made of the genitals of bulls? Because I bet you that the gold versus silver is the transcription error by the great Cassius instead of maybe in the original. I'm looking for that right now. No, I will not have to accept blame for that transcription error. Browne's page 317 of the edition we're using says there is but one mineral that will solder gold and silver together. So he must be just wrong there then.
And I noticed the Perseus does have, again, gold unto gold.
Yeah.
That's interesting. It says, again, gold unto gold doth not one substance bind, and only one. So I'm not quite sure where he's going at there. Is he saying that, something, there's not one substance that can bind gold to gold, but it's not right. It's definitely gold and gold in the Latin. So
gold and silver is an alloy that people use all the time, right? Is that a special alloy that's the way gold rings are, as usual. I'm the layman and at the lowest level of analysis, but I've always read that gold on its own is very soft, and so to toughen it up for jewelry, you put something else in it. What is it silver you put in it, or is it brass or something else?
As I'm aware of this, a very common addition is silver, and another which is often used, for example, in Italian, is copper.
Okay.
Yeah, so electrum is a naturally occurring alloy of gold and silver with trace amounts of copper and other metals. The Greeks called it gold or white gold, as opposed to refined gold. Its color ranges from pale to bright yellow, depending on the proportions of gold and silver, It has been produced artificially and is also known as green gold. There are a lot more kinds of gold than I thought.
No, not aware of those either. But of course, it all comes together to the hooks and the eyes, as it were, which holds things together according to the last sentence of 1065. Anybody have anything else on that?
Yeah, it's quite interesting. So they could do soldering at that time already, no?
I've never really fully understood what soldering means, frankly. What is soldering? I know what you do with the electrical heat gun and so forth, but what does soldering mean, really?
It means, as opposed to welding, in soldering you use a different material, which is then typically has a lower melting point, and then the two metals you want to solder together, and so only this intermediate metal becomes liquid. And then you bring it in between the two metals to be connected together. And when this cools down and solidifies, then you have a fairly tough connection.
And so welding is different in what way?
Yeah, there you use basically the same material. You need to melt both sides of that material. So, you will not bring in typically something what is fundamentally different. You may add the same material again or not. So I'm not that familiar with welding. But from my background in electronics industry, of course, I know soldering.
I have never understood that point, but now that you've brought it up, it makes perfect sense that welding might be just melting the materials that are involved, while soldering could be introducing a third material or different material from outside. I do have the impression that welding takes place at a lot higher temperature than soldering does.
Yes, of course, you need to go to the melting points of what you want to weld. So typically iron, which has a much higher melting point than tin. So that means you really need to then go to that high temperature. And typically the welding joint is also has much higher strength than a solder joint.
Yeah, I think looking at what technologies the ancients actually had might be an interesting little side note once we post it on the forum too. Because I'm always amazed at the things that they did know in those sorts of technology veins that it's like, I didn't realize they did that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it says here on Wikipedia that electrum, which is this naturally occurring alloy of gold, silver, and copper, was also used in the making of ancient drinking vessels and sometimes as an exterior coating of the pyramidions atop ancient pyramids and obelisks.
Wow.
Never heard that.
That's one of the things, and this is, again, completely out in left field, but I think that's the thing that annoys me the most about the Ancient Aliens sorts of shows, that the ancients were every bit as curious and technologically adept as we are. They just didn't have the materials and the tools to work with. But I mean, they could come up with anything that they needed to do with the tools and experience that they had.
The Antikythera mechanism or whatever, maybe
right.
One of the best. I probably butchered this pronunciation of that, but that is a fascinating advanced clock type computer.
You're right. Absolutely a fascinating thing that they found.
Well, then moving forward from that transition paragraph, our last four sections we have for today is basically going to move us into the discussion of diseases and prepare us for next week's episode, which is probably going to be our final episode of the 6 books, where we go into the details of the plague of Athens. But before we get to the plague of Athens, he talks about the spread of disease through other areas, and that's what we'll talk about here in these final passages for today.
It seems to me, at least, that, I mean, generally he gets the right idea. I mean, you look at the Europeans coming to North America and that sort of thing, and the diseases that were brought over by the Europeans. And I mean, that he basically he's on the right track, at least it seems, in partially explaining the spread of disease and how different diseases inhabit different areas initially. And
he is a little bit right when he says water as a transmitter of disease. It's not so much correct when he's talking about air. But this was a very common idea all through antiquity and the Middle Ages, and even up to not the last century, the 19th century. Has anyone heard the term the big stink?
No.
The big stink. Okay, so before Louis Pasteur, so this is like the 1850s, I think. This is in the city of London, which has grown in size so hugely at the time of the Victorian era, that the Thames River is completely incapable of managing the input of sewage, factory runoff, that kind of thing. So you have this idea that bad odors or bad air spreads disease, and with the big stink was sort of the first real thing to prove that idea wrong. There's all kinds of really great quotes around here. There was a newspaper headline or a newspaper article at the time, and it says, at an end, it stinks.
What was at an end? Joshua, you might have broken up when you said that. You said something at an end.
Oh, okay. Yeah, he said gentility of speech is at an end. It stinks. And then he goes on to say, I can't remember exactly the words, but he says, whosoever inhales the vapor that stink will soon forget it, and very lucky if he lives to remember it.
That paints a vivid picture.
Oh, yeah. And you got to read the Wikipedia page on this, because they talk about sewage that's like 6 feet deep on the banks of the river, and it's absolutely awful. And there were two main heroes of the story. One of them was this guy named Basilgate, who was a civil engineer, and he proposed a system of sewers, which he eventually was allowed to construct, to actually get everything to flow out to the sea correctly. And the other guy was a doctor, and I need to find his name, but okay, it was Jon Snow. So you've got this. So the problem at this time in Europe is you've got cholera outbreaks that keep sweeping through the major cities of Europe, and it's being blamed on bad smells. And Jon Snow sort of did this primitive meta-analysis of where all the cholera outbreaks were happening, and he was able to trace it back to certain wells that were had been dug near cesspits. And so the waste from the cesspit was leaking into the well and causing a cholera outbreak just only in this one neighborhood. And so nobody believed him. He eventually, in fact, he was not vindicated in his lifetime. Nobody believed him. And then the great stink happened, and people began to understand it smells so bad in the city of London, and people aren't really getting all that sick. You know, you would expect a massive cholera outbreak if bad smells were the cause of it, and it wasn't happening. So this was the first indication that he was probably correct. And then Louis Pasteur in France did his experiments, and he was eventually totally vindicated after he died. Jon Snow is his name. So
Jon Snow did know something.
Yes, he did.
Wow, I can't even imagine. I mean, other than walking around nauseous, I guess, all the time in London, that's the only sort of cause of the big stink then, as far as disease goes. Wow.
The other things you may get from this, they're more subtle. So certainly there was a higher percentage of people who eventually suffered in their lungs, depending on what was the composition that was coming out. No? So
more chronic conditions, probably like asthma and breathing difficulties and things like that.
Yeah, so more subtle things to trace back, because not everybody would get it.
And if everybody was walking around with watery eyes and a sore throat, it was like, oh, that's just the way things are in London.
Well, let me make a quick comment on an interesting choice of words that really doesn't show up in today's Browne version, but I, for some reason, went down to Monroe in section 1125, and the middle sentence in that paragraph says, in like manner, pestilence often falls on kine, Kine, also, and a distemper too on the silly sheep. So I guess maybe that's worth commenting on too, the silly sheep versus, it looks like both Browne and Bailey used the word cattle, but I thought it had maybe an error in the Monroe version, but I've just looked at the original text book, and I don't know if you guys heard the word Kine for cattle.
Yeah, I think it's a Scottish term.
Yeah, I've definitely heard that term before. I can't think of a citation off the top of my head, but I'm very familiar with the word kine for cattle.
I remember hearing it in some Scottish folk tune, I think, at one point.
Okay. Well, that's probably extremely insignificant, but for somebody who really gets into all this, it would be interesting to figure out why the oldest text here that we have is the Browne and uses cattle, but Mr. Monroe must have been partly Scottish or something like that. So
Monroe is a Scottish name. That's true now that you mention it. That's right.
Well, next week we'll turn to the plague of Athens and finish the book, but we may be at the end of today's material. Before we turn to closing comments, does anybody have any additional details that have caught their eye in today's text?
Again, I think it strikes me that he was so close on some things, but even whenever he talks about when we draw our breath, we needs must suck this poison. And I mean, airborne illnesses and things like that are, of course, a thing, but to come up with that just as and as Joshua's mentioned about the waterborne illnesses, Just to sort of come up with that in an environment where sickness was seen as such a punishment from the gods and a problem with your humors and that sort of thing. I mean, to come up with this material reason for these things, I think is still an impressive feat, even if the details weren't necessarily correct.
I'm going to give you a quote from Michael Faraday. I cannot get off this big stink thing. He says, near the bridges, the feculents rolled up in clouds so dense that they were visible at the surface, even in water of this kind. The smell was very bad and common to the whole of the water. It was the same as that which now comes up from gully holes in the street. The whole river was, for the time, a real sewer.
Wow.
There's some great quotes from this. If you want to look at the newspaper articles that were published at the time, it's hilarious reading, I have to say.
Around what time was this?
This was in high summer, July and August, in 1858 in central London.
Okay.
We should have ancient texts which have the same descriptions for the river Tiber in Rome, no? Because that must have in ancient times already have been quite terrible.
That's a good point.
Yeah, I think you're totally accurate. I think that river was also quite bad at the height of Rome's power.
I mean, it's not much of a river in the first place, right? And probably doesn't have that vast a current.
Mm-hmm. Well, even in the 1970s, the Cuyahoga River caught fire in Cleveland and started the environmental movement. So the pollution of the rivers was a thing for thousands of years, evidently.
Yeah, when you say that, Don, that just reminds me that when I think pollution, I think of the industrial Midwest, like where I think you generally are. So, yes. Yeah. Or smog in Los Angeles, things like that.
Yep, exactly.
One thing that does catch my eye before we go to concluding comments is the very last sentence of what we're reading today, where it says, it makes no difference whether we travel to the places unfavorable to us and change the atmosphere which wraps around us, or whether nature without our choice brings to us a tainted atmosphere. It's still going to cause you trouble. So he's making the point that it doesn't matter whether we go to it or it comes to us, it's still going to cause us trouble if we come into contact with the wrong environment. Well, let's go ahead and talk about closing comments for the day. And always first, let's go to Martin.
I have no closing comment.
Joshua, more text on the big stink or anything you'd like to include today?
Oh, no, not at the moment. No, I can't think of anything. Closing comments.
All right, Don.
Yeah, the only thing I'll say again is what I said at the beginning. I find his powers of observation and his ability to convey those things in this metrical structure just always impressive. It always impresses me that the humanizing aspects that he can bring forward and just the idea of how closely he observed different phenomena is always strikes me.
Okay, well, with that, let's close for the day. Next week will be our final regular episode as we complete Book 6 of the text. So thanks for your time today, and thanks for listening, and we'll be back next week.
Thank you.
Okay.
All right, thank you.